Hello and welcome to From Darkness to Light, the story of soldiers in Scripture. My name is Brother Logan Isaac, and I'm recording this session, I think it was the fourth session, from our Bible study because I didn't manage to get it recorded while we were coming together as a group. But this session is titled Praised by Everyone, the martial landscape of Jesus' ministry. We're going to be talking about the land and how it plays into Jesus' ministry on earth. And so after Jesus' baptism and temptation, the Gospels describe the beginning of his ministry in and around his own hometown. This is important for many reasons, but the reason given by Matthew is that it is foretold by Isaiah 9. Matthew 4, verses 12 through 16. Now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulon and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. And here you can see it side by side. Matthew abbreviates it a bit, saying land of Zebulon, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. And Matthew depicts Jesus' temptation followed by John's arrest, and you can tell in Isaiah 9, 1 and 2, it goes into a little bit more detail. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt, the Lord brought into contempt the land of Zebulon and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. So what does this mean, those in darkness? And why does Matthew see a prophecy in Isaiah 9? And before we get to why, let's look at the parallel passage in Luke immediately following his temptation, which is also chapter 4. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Holy Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And he doesn't read from Isaiah 9, he reads from Isaiah 61, but we'll come back to that. For now, let's look at this land that is mentioned. And here you can see the map of Israel at the bottom. You can see, I forgot to animate it later, but the tribe of Judah and Simeon there at the bottom. Most of the rest of the tribe of Judah and Simeon is cut off, just because I've cropped it out to focus on the northern lands. It's a rough overlay, but here we can see the distribution of the land according to the latter half of the book of Joshua, with the Levitical sanctuary cities in red. I want you to take a look for a little while. Press pause if you like, and think about if you notice anything in particular. And here is a family tree for reference. Now, as I said, you can hit pause and think more in depth about it. But one of the things, or some of the things I noticed, are the half tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's children. They're called the half tribes because Joseph is not a tribe of Israel. Manasseh and Ephraim are, so there's actually 13 tribes. But then you take away one because the Levites didn't get any land. So there are 12 tribes with land, and the Levites possessed or oversaw the cities in red, these sanctuary cities. And you can see that Manasseh has two tribal allotments. They're huge. And then the other half tribe, Ephraim, has a pretty decent-sized allotment there just above Benjamin and below its half-tribal sibling, Manasseh. Ephraim is there in red. Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob, has Jerusalem there in the dark red. You can see Jerusalem just kind of barely there. And Judah actually has a lot below all this, you just can't see it. And then Simeon is surrounded by Judah. Zebulon and Naphtali, you can see in green and yellow there towards the top, respectively. And they include Nazareth, the holy city of Kadesh, or the sanctuary city Kadesh. Asher has the coast. Then there's Issachar up there as well. And then in the central plains you have Dan, and Gad on either side of Ephraim and Benjamin. And then Reuben has some city or some land south of this map area as well. And I will point out the family tree is wrong. As we mentioned in another video, Jesus descends genealogically from Aaron through Mary. There is no genetic material passed from Joseph, his adopted Davidic stepfather. So Jesus actually descends through Aaron and I think potentially Zadok, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check it. So in a biblical imagination, this is how the land is supposed to be divvied out. The tribes each have their own elders and chiefs, with judges occasionally arising to save Israel from their enemies. Instead, the tribes begin to war against each other. The bloody, chaotic tribal confederation fails to unify the people, and so maybe having a king will help, they think. So I'm going to keep the slides, but kind of melt everything together in what's called the United Kingdom of Israel. Saul is the first united king. Abimelech was before him, but that's another story. David does better, and then Solomon's prosperity actually sets up a divided kingdom. And that is because the taxes he implements for his building projects disproportionately harm the rural peasantry, who rebel at his death and form the so-called Kingdom of Israel, leaving Judah, Benjamin, and Levi as the southern kingdom of Judah in blue. Simeon left, Reuben joined them. The Levites, because they were, they were required to perform the rituals in Jerusalem at the temple, they also returned to the tribal allotment of Benjamin and the city of Jerusalem. By calling themselves Israel, the northern tribes are trying to claim themselves as the true embodiment of the biblical story, but without the Davidic bloodline. They set up their own monarchy as well as their own temple system with shrines in Dan and Bethel. In 722 BCE, they're destroyed by the Assyrians and considered lost. The southern kingdom, called Judah, survives on its own for another 135 years when Babylon carries most of its most influential Jews into exile in 587 BCE. So why are Zebulon and Naphtali singled out by Isaiah 9 in Matthew's account? Here they are on our trusty map, and let's zoom in and get a little bit closer. The simplest answer is that after undergoing his wilderness temptation somewhere in the central arid plains, Jesus is just returning home. Nazareth, after all, was right in the middle of Zebulon's tribal allotment. Capernaum, on the other hand, was a fishing village in the land of Naphtali, with exactly the kinds of people Jesus was looking for as apostles. But the Bible makes clear that these two tribes in particular represented Israel's ancient military history. Let's begin with the sons of Jacob behind these two Israelite tribes. Zebulon is mentioned first because he was the younger of the two. The last of Leah's 6 boys, he was the 10th son of Jacob, whose name means gift, dwelling, or honor. Naphtali, on the other hand, was the 6th son of Jacob and the youngest of 2 boys by Bilhah, Rachel's slave. They're relatively nondescript until the time of Judges, when their reputation is solidified as the commando clans of Israel. In the wilderness, Zebulon had been part of the vanguard of Israel as a member of the regiment or the camp of Judah on the east, facing the rising sun. Naphtali followed close behind, and this is in Numbers chapter 2. Naphtali was in the northern regiment of Dan, and when the tribes settled in the land, there the two tribes called upon by judges to take up arms and save Israel from her enemies. In Judges 4, the people were being oppressed by the Canaanite military commander Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Harosheth is a city south of the area of this map, and Hagoyim is a stand-in for the region within which the city is found. It's actually pejorative. It means simply the Gentiles, the nations, or more bluntly, not Israel, not one of us. Sisera is from Harosheth, in the land that is not ours, and the land that represents whatever it is that we are not. God hears the cry of the people and gives them the prophet Deborah, called Isha Lapidot. And no mention of a husband is made, so there's no reason to translate Isha as wife or spouse. She is instead a fiery woman, for Lapidot means flame or torch. She summons Barak, a Naphthalite from the Levitical sanctuary city of Kadesh in Naphtali. The word here is literally the holy city of Naphtali, which derives from the Hebrew word Kadesh or Kodos, which means holy. Notice that she outranks him. She is the judge, not him. He is ordered to march on Mount Tabor to contend with Sisera with a force of 10,000 sons of Naphtali and Zebulon. They prevail thanks to Jael, a descendant of Moses' in-laws, who drives a tent peg through Sisera's head. The Song of Deborah in Judges 5 is believed by textual critics to be one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Scripture, which elaborates on the victory of Zebulon and Naphtali while doling out schoolyard insults to the tribes who no-showed, saying, "Why did you sit among the sheepfolds, to hear the whistling of the flocks?" Among the clans of Reuben there were great searchings of heart, which is a way of saying they chickened out. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, why did you stay with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. The contrast is sharp and goes on to praise the troops who risked their lives in answering the tribal summons. Earlier in verse 14, Zebulon is said to carry the Sebet Sapar, which translates to something like the staff used by an officer, scribe, or accountant. Some might even go so far as to say a ruler's staff. But that's not all. The story of Gideon also features the heroism of these commando clans. In Judges 6:35, he calls on his tribe of Manasseh, as well as Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulon, to contend with the Midianites. The place of battle will be the hill or the tree of Mora. In Genesis 12, this is the site where the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. That's in Genesis 12, verse 7. By chapter 7 of Judges, Zebulon disappears, and Naphtali takes pride of place at the front of the list of tribes engaged in battle against the Midianites. Gideon's decisive victory, despite overwhelming odds, is seared into Israel's memory as the Day of Midian, akin to VE Day for the modern Western imagination. At least that's how Isaiah 9 uses the term. And that takes us back to Jesus and his earthly ministry. After he has prevailed against Satan's temptation, he does not simply return home. The decision is deliberate, calculated, part of a strategic engagement with Israel's troubled past. The first thing he does in Luke is to read from Isaiah 61 in his local synagogue. But the evangelist cuts the prophetic message at a decisive moment. Here's the rest. The whole passage from Isaiah 61 and 2, Luke matches almost word for word at first. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God to all who comfort and all who mourn." Matthew also draws upon Isaiah, but a different chapter and heavily redacted. Jesus only started his ministry once, so we must ask whether the two Gospels are making the same or a very similar point. So let's look at the passages from Isaiah in their own context. Take a moment to compare this ESV translation with some Hebrew transliterations with whatever translation you prefer. Are there any parallel associations you notice between Isaiah 61 that Luke uses and Isaiah 9 that Matthew uses? Isaiah, and by extension Matthew, point out that the land of the commando clans, the region where Jesus grows up, was viewed with contempt. It is ridiculed as Galil Hagoyim, the district, Galil, which becomes Galilee, Hagoyim, the non-Jews. Why might that be? The people associated with that place walk in Hosek, darkness, the exact same state from which the cosmos were rescued by God's Ruach, Spirit, in Genesis 1. So what might it mean that the proclamation of good news begins in this dark place? Who are the poor, broken-hearted captives trapped in gloom and anguish, upon whom God's blessed light has shone? And why might these people be necham, comforted by the day of God's nacham, vengeance? So these are not rhetorical questions. The Bible gives us hints to concrete answers. As a historically dominant tribe, Zebulon and Naphtali were the nominal leaders of the northern tribes. Their names were stand-ins for the rest. As the northernmost, they were the first to fall to Israel's enemies. Zebulon disappears again, absorbed into its larger neighbor to the north. In 1 Kings 15, all the land of Naphtali is destroyed by King Asa. And again, it's reemphasized in 2 Kings 15. All the land of Naphtali and all the people called to were captive and taken off to Assyria. Once praised by their military prowess, their defeat is particularly stinging, not unlike another major power's defeat a generation ago. And so I'm leaving this slide blank because I couldn't quite put into words that the difference in American culture, American military culture, between the early and late 20th century feels eerily similar to the story of Zebulon and Naphtali. After a reluctant entry into World War I, World War II became our high point, like Joshua's leadership in Canaan and inhabiting the Promised Land. But that confidence turned into arrogance, and the corrupting, forgotten war in Korea paved the way for total loss of moral authority in Vietnam. If the victories of World War I and II were king to Joshua's campaign in Canaan, Korea feels like Judges, and the slow corruption that followed feels like the divided kingdom and defeat in Vietnam. This is why the title of the Bible study is From Darkness to Light. Zebulon and Naphtali, when Jesus begins his ministry, were in darkness, and on them light has shone. There's very few ways to understand how Jesus inaugurates his ministry, other than that he begins with a disgraced military history of Israel, where all of the people's contempt was heaped first and ostensibly on their failed military personnel, but ultimately, really and truly, on themselves, by heaping contempt on their own tribes that had once stood proudly at the vanguard of their military forces. They ultimately also they feel contempt for themselves because Zebulon and Naphtali are part of Israel, no less than our soldiers and veterans are part of America. And so it feels so intimately linked. I don't know if I've ever heard a civilian read, the Gospels and the Old Testament this way, but it's the first thing that came into my mind as I began looking at some of the connections between the military and Israel. And so I'm leaving this slide blank in closing because I don't know what to make of it. These connections haven't been talked to is alarming, not just as someone who wants to read the Bible and wants to understand the history of the Bible having been read, but also as a soldier, as a veteran, bringing my experience to this place we call biblical scholarship. I'm left to wonder why we haven't seen these connections before. The Bible, if anything, takes for granted that we notice these things. Zebulon and Naphtali are important. Jesus chooses to go there. And both Isaiah 61 and Isaiah 9 suggest that the reasons for going there are to confront Israel's own disgraceful and disgraced past and people.